"Step aside. You don't belong here." The words were harsh, cutting through the air like a knife. Marcus hadn't even opened his mouth, but the security officer was already pulling him aside, as though he were a criminal, not a first-class passenger. The other travelers watched, not in concern, but in quiet agreement, as if they too thought he didn't fit the profile. Not with his calm demeanor, not with the silence he carried, and definitely not with the skin he was born in. The gate agent didn't even glance at his boarding pass, didn't need to, just the command, "Step aside, please." He wasn't even allowed the chance to speak, to explain himself, as he was led away like an intruder. The other passengers? They didn't bat an eye. They had no idea who he was. No idea that the very airline they thought they controlled had a history tied to him. An unrecognized hero whose silence would soon turn into a storm that would shake them all. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This wasn't just about who belonged in first class. This was about power, the kind they never saw coming. If you think you know how this story ends, think again. Hit like, subscribe for more, and drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think happens next? Where are you watching from? And what do you think of Marcus's journey so far? Share your thoughts below. Marcus had been flying for years. As a pilot for a major airline, his expertise had saved lives, made countless successful flights, and earned him the trust of the company. Yet, today, as he approached the gate for another routine flight, things felt different. He wasn't prepared for what was coming. It started with a look, just a flicker of hesitation in the eyes of the gate agent as he approached the counter. She didn't acknowledge him as she scanned the line, but then, when she saw Marcus, there was something about her gaze that made him pause. The line moved swiftly for others, but for him, it felt as if time slowed. He handed over his boarding pass, a first-class ticket like any other, but the agent didn't immediately scan it. Her eyes flicked back to the other passengers behind him before she reluctantly swiped his ticket. "Ma'am, step aside," she said flatly, her voice devoid of any warmth or courtesy. Marcus paused for a moment, bewildered. His first-class ticket was standard procedure. He had flown with this airline countless times, and his credentials were impeccable. But her tone, the way she said it, made him feel like he was being singled out. As he stepped aside, he noticed a few eyes on him, not in the way you would expect from a fellow traveler curious about another, but the kind of stare that felt like judgment, like he didn't belong in that space. He was used to this feeling, the sensation that he didn't quite belong in the world he had earned his place in. His whole life, he had faced doubts about his capabilities based solely on how he looked. But today felt different. There was something palpable in the air, something more than the usual discomfort he had come to accept. A heavy weight settled in his chest as he was escorted to the side, and Marcus couldn't help but notice how easily the other passengers walked past him, hardly glancing at his face. The gate agent, a woman of no more than 30, stood rigid as she checked the next passenger's ticket. She didn't even offer him an apology, not even a glance. She simply ignored him, as if his existence was irrelevant, an inconvenience. "Please wait here," she instructed, never looking up. In the distance, a flight attendant passed by, glancing briefly at Marcus before continuing her duties. She didn't seem bothered, didn't even break stride as she walked past the pilot of a plane she would soon be flying on. Marcus swallowed hard. This wasn't the first time he had been treated this way, but it still stung. As he waited, other passengers continued to move smoothly through security and boarding, all of them oblivious to the quiet injustice unfolding just steps away. Minutes passed, and Marcus grew increasingly frustrated, but he didn't speak up. He knew better. In his line of work, you learn that sometimes silence is a weapon, one that can be wielded with precision. However, today, silence felt like his only option. What could he say? He wasn't being treated this way because of who he was as a pilot, but because of something far more insidious. It was the way people like him were often seen, as if they didn't quite belong in certain places, like first class, like a pilot seat. Finally, the gate agent called him forward in a sharp, impersonal tone. "Sir, please come this way. We need to verify your credentials." Marcus's heart sank. Verify his credentials? He had been flying for nearly 15 years, had a spotless record, and yet, here he was, standing at the gate of an airplane, as if he were an imposter. He followed her quietly down the hallway to a small, isolated room. The door clicked shut behind them, and he was instructed to take a seat across from a man in a crisp suit who did not introduce himself. Instead, the man began speaking immediately. "Mr. Williams, we need to confirm some details with you before we can let you board the flight," he said, his voice steady, but cold. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was used to procedures, but this felt different. This wasn't a routine check. This was something personal. He could feel the weight of their suspicion in the air, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just about verifying his credentials. It was about the idea that someone like him wasn't expected to be in this position. As the man flipped through a folder in front of him, Marcus's mind began to race. He was an accomplished pilot, with hundreds of thousands of miles flown safely. He had proven himself countless times. And yet, he was being treated like an outsider. A part of him wanted to challenge it, to fight back, to demand an explanation. But he knew better. Fighting would only make him look like a troublemaker. Instead, he remained silent, watching as the man continued to flip through his paperwork, almost as if searching for a reason to disqualify him. "Everything seems in order," the man said after a few moments, but the words felt hollow. "You're free to board, but we will need you to wait here until the other passengers have cleared." Marcus stood up and nodded, offering no words. He walked back to the gate, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him again. This time, there was no smile, no recognition of the fact that he was the one about to fly them all safely to their destination. He was just another passenger, just another man of color who didn't belong in the place he had worked so hard to earn. As he boarded the plane, the usual feeling of pride and accomplishment that came with sitting in the cockpit was absent. All he could feel was the heavy weight of the discrimination, the sense that no matter how far he had come, he would always be seen as less than. The moment Marcus stepped up to the security checkpoint, he felt the familiar sting of discomfort. After what had already been a tense start to his day, he had hoped that the rest of the process would go smoothly. But, as usual, reality had other plans. He approached the TSA agent, who looked at his boarding pass, then at him, then back at the boarding pass, hesitating for a fraction of a second. Marcus didn't say anything, but that hesitation lingered in the air, thick and palpable. It was something he had experienced countless times before, but today it felt sharper, more deliberate. The agent glanced up at Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly. Without a word, he motioned for Marcus to step aside and go through a different security line. The other passengers behind him, some of whom Marcus knew to be less experienced travelers, were breezing through the standard checks with little to no scrutiny. He felt the tension rise in his chest, but said nothing. He knew the drill. He had seen it before. When you didn't fit the mold, when you didn't look the part, the process seemed to become unnecessarily complex. As he moved to the separate line, he caught a glimpse of a white male pilot ahead of him, casually walking through with a relaxed smile, not even sparing the security agent a second glance. He was waved through immediately, his process quick and seamless. Marcus couldn't help but notice the stark contrast. It wasn't just about the job or the flight. It was about how his very presence seemed to disrupt the expected order, as if his credentials didn't matter as much as the color of his skin. The TSA agent, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut, motioned for Marcus to step into a side room, away from the regular flow of passengers. Marcus complied, knowing that arguing would make matters worse. "Please wait here," the agent said curtly, barely making eye contact. He didn't offer any explanation, just a sharp command. The small room was stark and clinical, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Marcus stood there, feeling the weight of their suspicion press against him. He could feel his pulse quicken as he waited for what felt like an eternity. It wasn't just a random check. It was something more, something targeted. The agent didn't speak as he began rummaging through Marcus's carry-on bag, pulling out items one by one and inspecting them with unnecessary thoroughness. "Legal documents," the agent said, holding up a manila folder that Marcus had packed at the last minute. "What's this?" Marcus, trying to stay calm, responded with his usual grace. "Private documents," he said, maintaining a level of professionalism even as his patience began to thin. It wasn't the first time his personal items had been subjected to unnecessary inspection, but today, for some reason, it felt different. He had nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of, but the feeling that his every move was being scrutinized felt unnerving. The agent turned the folder over, looking for something that would justify further questioning, but found nothing. He gave Marcus an almost imperceptible shrug before returning the documents to the bag, as though trying to convince himself that this was just routine. But it wasn't. The way he handled the situation felt far more invasive than necessary. It was as though Marcus had been selected, not for any legitimate reason, but because of an invisible assumption that he was out of place. It wasn't just about the security check, it was about power and control, and Marcus could feel it in the air like static. After a few minutes of silent, uncomfortable rifling through his belongings, the agent finally waved Marcus through. "You're free to go," he muttered, though his tone carried none of the politeness he showed to other passengers. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he nodded stiffly and walked back toward the main terminal area, already dreading the next stage of the process. As he rejoined the queue to board, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him was out of sync with reality. Why was this happening to him? He had flown hundreds of times, worked tirelessly to get to this position, and yet it was as if the universe itself was conspiring to remind him that no matter how high he flew, he would always be judged for the wrong reasons. The worst part was that no one acknowledged the discomfort, no one saw how different he was being treated. The passengers around him seemed oblivious to the quiet, humiliating interrogation he had just undergone. They were wrapped up in their own worlds, focused on their phones or chatting with travel companions, unaware of the racial undertones that lingered in the air. As Marcus reached the gate, his discomfort was only amplified. The same gate agent who had directed him to wait earlier gave him a quick glance before returning her attention to the line. This time, she didn't even acknowledge him. No good morning, no smile, nothing. Just the cold, impersonal scan of his boarding pass. "Sit down, Mr. Williams," she said flatly, not bothering to look at him as she handed him his seat assignment. He did as instructed, though the seat didn't feel like his. He was used to sitting in the cockpit, used to being the one in charge, the one everyone else relied on. But now, seated among the other passengers, he felt like an imposter in his own seat. It wasn't just a plane that felt wrong. It was the world he had to navigate in order to survive. As he settled into his seat, he saw the crew preparing for boarding, their movements practiced and professional. They exchanged pleasantries with the white passengers ahead of him, each of them treated with the same courtesy Marcus had long been denied. The interaction was casual, light, and seamless. But when it was Marcus's turn to board, the flight attendants barely acknowledged his presence. He was simply another body passing through, unimportant in the grand scheme of things. At this point, Marcus had already grown accustomed to this kind of treatment. It had become a routine in his life, one that he had learned to endure silently. But today, something in him snapped. Perhaps it was the accumulation of the years of subtle bias he had endured. Or perhaps it was the fact that this wasn't just any flight. This was his flight, the one where his silence would no longer be enough. The flight attendants gave him his seat with little more than a cursory glance, not even a smile or a polite greeting. He took his seat quietly, feeling the weight of their indifference. But what struck him more than anything was the casual ease with which they moved on to serve the white passengers, almost as if they knew exactly who belonged in this space. It wasn't just about him being a pilot. It was about how he was seen, or rather not seen. And then it hit him. This wasn't just about the flight. This was about power. The power they thought they held. The power they exercised every day in their small, subtle ways. The power that made him, no matter how skilled, no matter how experienced, feel like he was always an outsider in a world that was never meant for him. As Marcus made his way through the bustling airport terminal after the unwarranted security check, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. It wasn't just the frustration of being treated differently because of his race. It was the way people treated him, as though he didn't belong in the space he had worked tirelessly to reach. Marcus had flown over 1,000 hours, had commanded dozens of different types of aircraft, and yet, to some people, he would always be seen as less than. This was the truth he had come to accept over the years. But today, the truth felt more like an accusation than a fact. When he approached the check-in counter again, he wasn't sure what to expect. The gate agent from before had already made it clear that he wasn't the kind of person she expected to be standing in front of her, much less someone who could fly a plane. As he handed his boarding pass to the same agent who had questioned him earlier, he noticed something in her demeanor that sent a jolt of unease through him. She scanned the pass with no enthusiasm, her eyes lingering on the name for a moment longer than necessary. There was no greeting, no attempt to make him feel like a valued customer, just the same cold indifference. But as he waited for the next step in the process, Marcus overheard something that made his blood run cold. One of the flight attendants, a woman in her mid-30s with a perfect smile, leaned over to a colleague standing just behind Marcus. The two of them were talking, as if they didn't realize Marcus could hear every word. "Look at him," the flight attendant whispered, barely concealing her disdain. "He probably only has that first-class seat because of diversity quotas, not because he's a good pilot." The way she said it was dripping with contempt. The words felt like a punch in the gut. Marcus froze for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. It was one thing to face the subtle racism that had been a part of his life for as long as he could remember. It was another thing entirely when it was spoken so openly, as if his accomplishments didn't matter, as if his years of experience were irrelevant because of the color of his skin. He had earned every inch of his career, every promotion, every opportunity. And yet, to this woman, to so many people like her, it didn't matter. The idea that he could be seen as less than because of his background was something he could never fully prepare himself for, no matter how many times it happened. He tried to ignore their words, to focus on the task at hand. But the sting of what he had just overheard lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. He had learned long ago to keep his composure, to let the slights roll off him like water off a duck's back. But today, it felt impossible to shake off that comment. Was this how people saw him? As just a token? As someone who was only there because of an arbitrary number on a diversity chart? The thought was suffocating. He had worked hard for his position, sacrificed so much, and yet to others, it was all just a footnote in their narrative. As Marcus approached the boarding area, trying to regain his focus, he was suddenly acutely aware of every movement, every glance, every whisper around him. He could hear the voices of the other passengers as they spoke to one another, but one voice in particular caught his attention. A man sitting near the cockpit door, a middle-aged white passenger with a briefcase, was talking to the person sitting next to him. Marcus wasn't sure whether the man meant for him to hear, but he did, and the words hit him like a blow to the stomach. "Do you see him?" the man said quietly, leaning in toward his seatmate. "That guy doesn't look like a first-class pilot. I'm not sure he even knows how to fly a plane. There's no way he's up to the job." The way the man said it was so casual, as if it was an accepted truth that Marcus didn't belong in that position. The comment was soft enough that most people might not have noticed, but Marcus heard it clearly. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his abilities based on his appearance, but hearing it so openly in front of other passengers made it feel more personal. Marcus could feel the eyes of the people around him shift, could feel the invisible weight of their judgment. He had no idea whether the man had intended for him to overhear, but the message was clear. This was a man who saw him not as a professional, but as a symbol, a stereotype. It didn't matter that Marcus had spent his life proving his worth. It didn't matter that he was an accomplished pilot with a spotless record. To this man, to so many people like him, Marcus was nothing more than an exception to the rule, a rarity, a curiosity, and certainly not someone worthy of the responsibility that came with flying a plane. He could feel his blood boiling, but he kept his face stoic, his gaze fixed on the ground in front of him. He knew better than to react. He had been in this situation far too many times before. It wasn't worth it. Arguing would only confirm the stereotype, And in that moment, Marcus knew he needed to pick his battles carefully. But the humiliation, the injustice, burned deep within him. He wasn't just a pilot to these people. He wasn't even a person. He was a representative of something they didn't understand, something they weren't willing to accept. The whispers around him didn't stop. Other passengers, noticing the brief exchange, began to look his way, their gazes filled with suspicion. It wasn't just the man by the door. Now there were others quietly scrutinizing him, their judgment as clear as day. Marcus couldn't escape it. No matter where he went, no matter how hard he worked to prove himself, he would always be seen through the lens of those biases. The agent called his name again, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Mr. Williams, your seat is ready." He nodded silently and walked towards the jet bridge, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. But as he made his way through the crowded cabin, Marcus couldn't help but notice how the passengers around him were whispering. The comment he overheard lingered in his mind like a constant hum, and he couldn't shake the feeling that his every move was being watched, judged. As he walked down the aisle of the plane, he felt their eyes on him, the quiet murmurs growing louder in his head. He was no longer just a passenger on the plane. He was a symbol of everything they thought he shouldn't be. But what could he do? What could he say? They wouldn't listen. They would never understand. And so Marcus kept walking, his face expressionless, his heart heavy with the weight of their judgment. He took his seat, trying to ignore the silent criticism that surrounded him, but it was impossible to escape. The flight had been going smoothly for the most part. The engine hummed steadily, and the passengers were all settled in, enjoying their in-flight entertainment or dozing off into a peaceful nap. Marcus, having left the cockpit earlier, was sitting among the first-class passengers, quietly watching the clouds below. He had hoped the day would end without any more disruptions, but fate, as it often did, had other plans. Suddenly, the calm was shattered by a loud, disorienting sound, the unmistakable alarm signaling an emergency. Marcus's body tensed as he heard the captain's voice crackle through the overhead speakers, calling for immediate assistance. "We have a situation," the captain's voice said, strained and urgent. "I need someone with experience. I repeat, someone with experience." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard the tone in the captain's voice, and it was a tone that no seasoned pilot could ignore. The plane was in distress, and every second counted. Without thinking, Marcus stood up, his military training kicking in. He couldn't ignore the call for help, not when lives were at stake. Despite having no intention of being involved in the flight once he had exited the cockpit, the urgency was too great. He pushed past the flight attendants who were standing nervously in the aisle, unsure of what to do, and made his way to the cockpit. As he arrived at the door, a flight attendant caught his arm, blocking his path. "What are you doing?" she asked with a mix of surprise and suspicion. "I'm a pilot." "I need to get in," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. There was no time to waste. The flight attendant hesitated, looking between Marcus and the cockpit door, but something in his eyes made her step aside. She didn't say anything, but her eyes lingered on him as if questioning his right to be there. Marcus opened the door and stepped into the cockpit. The captain and first officer both looked relieved to see him. "We have a serious issue with one of the engines," the captain said quickly, explaining the situation. "We're losing altitude rapidly, and I need your help to stabilize the plane. Can you take over for a moment?" Without hesitation, Marcus slid into the seat and took over the controls. His hands were steady, his mind sharp despite the chaos unfolding around him. Years of training and experience kicked in as he assessed the problem and began to make adjustments. The other flight crew members watched him, but no one said a word as he worked quickly and efficiently to bring the plane back to a safe altitude. The situation, though critical, began to stabilize under his command. Outside the cockpit, the flight attendants had gathered in the galley, nervously discussing the situation. But even as Marcus worked seamlessly in the cockpit, handling the emergency with grace, the flight attendants continued to glance at each other, whispering under their breath. There was no applause for his skill, no recognition for his actions. Instead, they acted as though he were simply doing what was expected. as if his presence in the cockpit was no more extraordinary than any other pilot's. For Marcus, the silence was deafening. He had just taken control of a life-or-death situation, a situation that could have resulted in a crash had it not been for his quick thinking. And yet, no one outside the cockpit seemed to acknowledge it. The flight attendants, whom Marcus had spent years working with, acted as though his expertise didn't matter. He wasn't a hero in their eyes. He was just another black man doing his job, something that they had come to expect from him, but not something they appreciated. The emergency was eventually resolved. The plane stabilized, and the immediate danger passed. The passengers, many of whom had been unaware of how close they had come to disaster, returned to their in-flight routines, blissfully unaware of what had just transpired in the cockpit. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of isolation, of being invisible in a moment when his skills should have been recognized. As the plane continued on its course, the passengers remained oblivious to the drama that had unfolded just moments before. But in the back of the cabin, a few people began to murmur. They had overheard snippets of conversation and saw the way the flight attendants had acted, and some of them started to piece together the truth. One of the passengers, a middle-aged man sitting near the cockpit, had recognized Marcus from a previous flight. He leaned over to his seatmate, whispering under his breath. "That guy," he said, nodding in Marcus's direction. "He's the one who saved hundreds of lives in that crash a few years back." His voice carried the weight of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite believe that the same man who had just saved the plane was the same man who had made headlines years ago. The seatmate, a woman in her 40s, glanced at Marcus before nodding in recognition. "I remember that crash," she said, her voice low. "He was the one who guided the plane to safety after the engines failed. They said he was a hero." Other passengers, overhearing this conversation, began to chime in, adding their own bits of information. "He's the one they called in when that other plane went down, right?" one man asked, looking up from his magazine. "Yeah, that's him," another passenger answered. "I saw him on TV after that. He was the one who stayed calm under pressure and got everyone out safely." Despite the murmurs, no one addressed Marcus directly. No one came forward to thank him for his quick thinking, for his bravery, for the lives he had saved. Instead, they kept their distance, as though they were uncertain about how to treat him. They were impressed by his skills, certainly, but they were hesitant to acknowledge that he was the same person they had previously judged and assumed was not worthy of being in a position of power. Marcus sat in his seat, feeling the weight of their recognition, without ever truly receiving it. Their acknowledgement, though sincere in some ways, felt hollow. It was as if they could only see him for his past accomplishments, not for what he had just done. His work on the flight was nothing more than an extension of his identity as a black man who had once been seen as a hero, rather than the living, breathing pilot who had just saved them all in the present moment. He didn't need their praise, but in that moment it would have been nice to feel seen, to feel like his contribution was recognized for what it was, rather than just an afterthought in a story that others had already written for him. As the flight went on, Marcus couldn't help but think about the way people viewed him. They saw the headlines from the past, but they didn't see the man in front of them, the pilot who had just put everything on the line to ensure their safety. The truth, as he had come to understand it, was that he would always be judged by the way others saw him, not by his abilities, not by his accomplishments, but by the assumptions that had been made about him long before they ever met him. Marcus had been flying for years, his career marked by countless hours in the cockpit, making split-second decisions that kept hundreds of passengers safe. He had always been proud of his work, but what most people didn't know was that his expertise went beyond the cockpit. Marcus wasn't just a pilot. He was also one of the key figures behind some of the most significant advancements in aviation safety technology. And today, as fate would have it, the CEO of the airline would soon discover just how deep Marcus's influence truly ran. It started with a random encounter. After the plane had landed and the passengers had disembarked, Marcus was heading to the lounge when he happened to bump into the CEO of the airline, a tall man in his late 50s with a no-nonsense attitude. Marcus had seen the CEO in passing many times over the years, but their interactions had always been brief, often only a nod or a handshake. Today, however, was different. "Mr. Williams," the CEO said, his voice more friendly than Marcus had ever heard before. "Good to see you. I hope your flight went smoothly." Marcus nodded, the small talk feeling awkward given their history. He had always respected the CEO for his business acumen, but had never quite trusted him. The CEO's track record was one of sharp decisions and corporate maneuvering, and Marcus often felt like he was just another cog in the machine. "It went well, thank you," Marcus replied, trying to keep the conversation casual. The CEO studied him for a moment before speaking again, his tone a little more serious. "I wanted to ask you something. I've heard some interesting things about you. Things I didn't know." Marcus raised an eyebrow, curious about what the CEO meant. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said cautiously. The CEO smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who had just put two and two together. "I've been hearing some rumors lately about your involvement in aviation safety technology. You've been a key figure in some of the innovations that have saved countless lives over the years, haven't you?" Marcus was taken aback. He had never publicly revealed his role in the development of these technologies. In fact, he had kept his investments in safety tech a secret, not wanting to draw attention to himself. But now, standing face to face with the CEO, it seemed like the right moment to finally speak up. "That's true," Marcus said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I've been involved in some of the most important advancements in aviation safety. The technology that's been saving lives during emergencies. It's something I've invested in and helped develop." The CEO's eyes widened slightly. "You're telling me you're the one behind all of that?" Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. For years, he had worked in the shadows, pouring money into research and development, knowing that his contributions were making a difference, but never getting the recognition. Today, that was about to change. "I'm one of the key investors," Marcus continued. "I've helped fund several companies that are now at the forefront of aviation safety. Some of the emergency systems that are standard in commercial jets today, systems that have saved lives during critical situations, were made possible because of my involvement." The CEO looked stunned. He had been in the industry long enough to understand the value of such technology, but he had never imagined that Marcus, a man he had only ever seen as a pilot, was behind it. "I had no idea," the CEO said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've been a silent partner in these developments. You've been saving lives, and no one knew about it." Marcus shrugged, the weight of the conversation heavy on his shoulders. "I didn't do it for the recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do. But I've been part of some very lucrative investments. This company," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "this airline wouldn't be where it is today without these advancements." The CEO took a step back, processing the information. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, his mind racing. "I had no idea. You've been an integral part of this entire industry, and I've been treating you like just another pilot." Marcus said nothing, but the silence between them spoke volumes. For the first time in their entire professional relationship, the CEO was seeing Marcus in a new light, not just as a pilot, but as an influential figure in the aviation industry, someone who had helped shape the safety standards that the airline and many others depended on. The CEO's face shifted from surprise to something else, something darker. "How much have you invested, Marcus?" he asked, his voice lowering. Marcus paused, but only for a moment. "I've been involved in deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. More than that, actually. My investments have made a significant impact on this company's bottom line." The CEO's eyes narrowed as the implications of Marcus's words sank in. "So you're telling me that the advancements we've been able to implement, safety systems, technology, equipment, were all possible because of your financial backing? And now, you're telling me you're sitting on the ability to make or break this company?" Marcus could feel the tension thickening between them. The CEO had made a fortune off of Marcus's investments without ever acknowledging his role. Now that the truth was out, it was clear that Marcus held a considerable amount of power that the CEO hadn't even realized until now. "I'm not here to break the company," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. "I'm here because I want what's best for this airline. But you need to understand something. When you treat people a certain way, when you dismiss them, when you push them aside without seeing their value, you risk losing everything. The CEO's face darkened. "I've made a lot of decisions that have worked in the company's favor," he said, his tone defensive. "But if what you're saying is true, if you're really the one who has funded all of this, if you're the reason we're still around, then it's not just your career that's at risk. It's mine too, isn't it?" Marcus nodded slowly. "If the truth gets out about how you've been treating me and other people like me, the company could face massive repercussions. Not just financially, but publicly. The trust that you've built with the shareholders, with the public, everything could collapse." The CEO stood frozen for a moment, as if the weight of what Marcus was saying had just hit him full force. "I had no idea," he repeated, this time softer, almost regretful. "I never understood who you really were. I've taken you for granted." Marcus met his gaze, his expression hard. "It's not just me. It's about everyone you've pushed aside. Everyone who's ever been overlooked. You can't just expect to profit from people like me without acknowledging them, without treating them with respect." The CEO, now looking more contemplative than before, took a deep breath. "I think I need to rethink some things," he said, the realization of what he had done settling in. Marcus nodded, knowing that his words had struck home. But he wasn't done yet. The real battle was only beginning. The reality of Marcus's revelation weighed heavily on the CEO's mind as he sat in his office, looking out over the sprawling skyline. The conversation with Marcus had opened a floodgate of realizations, each one more uncomfortable than the last. What had seemed like a random encounter had turned into a game changer, not only for Marcus, but for the entire airline. As the CEO stared out the window, the full weight of what Marcus had told him began to sink in. Marcus wasn't just a skilled pilot, as the CEO had previously assumed. He wasn't just a passive investor either. Marcus was one of the key players behind the airline's survival, one of the unseen figures who had quietly built the foundation of their safety systems, their technologies, and their profitability. And now, that truth had the potential to upend everything. The CEO's mind raced as he thought about the decisions that had led him to this point. Over the years, he had relied on corporate strategies that prioritized growth, efficiency, and profit margins. But he had overlooked the human element, the people who were the true drivers behind the company's success. Marcus had never been just another pilot. He had been the one who ensured that the airline stayed ahead in the face of growing competition, investing in technology that made the airline a leader in safety. Without those investments, without the technologies Marcus had backed, the company might not have made it this far. In fact, Marcus had unknowingly secured the company's future with the $100 million he had poured into aviation safety, a move that no one had ever fully appreciated. The CEO stood up abruptly, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. He needed to fix this immediately. If Marcus had the power to shift the financial future of the company, then there was no time to waste. He had been dismissive of Marcus, had treated him as just another employee, never fully recognizing his worth. But now, the truth was clear. Marcus had been quietly driving the company's success, and the CEO had been blind to it. He quickly made a few calls, his mind still racing. Word of Marcus's involvement in the safety systems had already started to leak within the management ranks. It wasn't long before investors caught wind of it. Rumors spread quickly, and the gravity of the situation became more apparent. The airline, which had been riding a wave of success, now faced a major risk. If the public and the investors realized just how much Marcus had been responsible for, it could be disastrous for the company's reputation. Marcus's involvement in the safety technology wasn't just a footnote in the company's history. It was a key element in their competitive advantage. Without the systems Marcus had invested in, the airline would have fallen behind its competitors, unable to provide the level of security that passengers had come to expect. In a world where safety was paramount, the airline's reputation hinged on these technologies. And yet, no one had ever fully acknowledged the role that Marcus played in making these advancements possible. As the CEO sat in his office, he realized that Marcus was not just an asset to the airline. He was the foundation on which the airline's future rested. The investments Marcus had made into aviation safety had shaped the very systems that kept the airline profitable. And now those same investments could either save the company or bring it to its knees. The CEO had to act fast. He could no longer afford to make the same mistakes. He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the head of the investment division. "We need to talk now," he said, his voice sharp and urgent. The minutes felt like hours as he waited for the call to be returned. The gravity of the situation was not lost on him. Marcus had quietly positioned himself at the center of the airline's success, and now that the truth had come to light, there was no turning back. The head of investments arrived shortly after, looking nervous and unsure of what to expect. As soon as he entered the CEO's office, the CEO wasted no time. "Marcus," he began, "is more than just a pilot. He's been a driving force behind our most important technology. I didn't realize the extent of his involvement, but now I see that his contributions are the reason we've made it this far. His investments have saved us millions, and if we don't act quickly, we could lose everything." The head of investments frowned. "But we've always known that safety technology was a critical part of our business. How is this any different?" The CEO sighed, rubbing his temples. "What we didn't realize is that Marcus is behind much of that technology. He's the one who invested in the systems that made our planes safer, the systems that have kept us ahead of the competition. He's invested over $100 million in safety tech, and no one knew. Not even I knew the full extent of his involvement until today. This is bigger than just a financial commitment. This is about our survival." The head of investments sat down, the realization hitting him like a wave. "So what do we do now?" "We need to meet with Marcus," the CEO said, his voice resolute. "We need to make it right. He's more valuable to this company than we ever realized. If we don't show him the respect he deserves, we risk losing everything. The public has no idea what he's done for us. The investors will soon catch wind of this, and we need to get ahead of it." As the CEO continued to strategize, he couldn't help but think about the conversations he had overheard in the company's halls. The whispers, the dismissive attitudes toward Marcus. How had they not seen the man for who he truly was? He had been the architect of their safety systems, the unsung hero of their success. Now, the truth was coming to light, and the company had to face the consequences of their ignorance. The news began to spread rapidly within the company. Marcus's role in the safety technology was no longer a secret. It was like a domino effect. Managers, engineers, and even middle-tier staff started to realize that the advancements they had taken for granted were the result of Marcus's foresight and financial backing. The higher-ups who had once looked down on him were now scrambling to figure out how to navigate the situation. But the real test would come when the investors got wind of it. Investors who had always been concerned with profitability and growth would now have to confront the fact that the man they had underestimated was the very person who had made their investments profitable. Without Marcus's innovations, the company's bottom line would have been severely impacted. The CEO's worst fear was coming to life. The very man they had sidelined was the reason for their success, and if the news spread unchecked, it could trigger a financial disaster. The CEO knew that they needed to act quickly and decisively. The fate of the company rested in the hands of someone they had never truly appreciated, the very person they had tried to undermine. The meeting between Marcus and the CEO had gone better than expected. After the shocking revelation about Marcus's pivotal role in the airline's success, the CEO had acknowledged the gravity of his mistakes. The initial shock had given way to a quiet but firm resolve. The CEO was not one to back down from responsibility, and the fact that Marcus had been treated as anything less than a valuable asset weighed heavily on his conscience. For the first time, he understood how far his oversight had stretched, not just in terms of business, but in the deeply ingrained biases that had poisoned the company's culture. "I owe you more than just an apology," the CEO said in a private meeting later that day. His tone was sincere, but the weight of the situation made his words feel heavy, laden with the responsibility of making things right. "The way you've been treated, the way the company has operated, it's unacceptable." We've allowed a culture of complacency and ignorance to foster in the ranks. And it's time to fix that. Marcus listened quietly, the sting of the past still fresh, but the possibility of change hung in the air like a fragile thread. The CEO, visibly shaken by the realization that his decisions had been influenced by unconscious biases, didn't just offer a cursory apology. Instead, he set a course for action. "We are going to make this right, Marcus. Not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been overlooked or treated unfairly within this company. I want to overhaul the way we operate to ensure that we are truly fair and equitable, both internally and externally." It wasn't just an apology, it was a pledge. The CEO outlined a plan for a company-wide reform, one that would address the systematic issues that had allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked. There would be new diversity and inclusion programs, comprehensive sensitivity training for all employees, and a dedicated team focused on ensuring fairness and accountability at every level of the company. It was a bold move, and Marcus had to admit that he was surprised by the CEO's commitment to creating a truly inclusive environment. This wasn't just lip service, it was an attempt to rebuild trust that had been shattered by years of ignorance and bias. But the changes didn't stop there. The CEO looked at Marcus with a newfound respect, acknowledging the value of his experience, not just as a pilot, but as a leader in the industry. "Marcus, you've proven yourself in ways that go beyond just flying. Your understanding of the industry, your dedication to safety, and your commitment to fairness make you the perfect person to lead these efforts." Marcus's heart beat a little faster at the implication. He hadn't expected anything like this. He was a pilot, not an executive, not someone who had been involved in company management decisions. But in that moment, he realized that his role was about to change. The CEO's eyes locked with his as he continued, "I want you to come back to the cockpit, Marcus. But not just as a pilot. I want you to oversee the training programs for pilots, flight crews, and staff. You'll be the one to ensure that every person who walks through these doors understands the importance of fairness, equality, and respect in this industry." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had come to terms with the idea that he would always be confined to a certain role, limited by the biases of others. But here was an opportunity for him to make a lasting impact, to shape the future of the airline in a way that reflected the values he had always championed. Values of equity, fairness, and respect for all people, regardless of their background. The offer was both a recognition of his talent and an acknowledgement of his worth. But more than that, it was a statement of intent. The CEO wasn't just giving Marcus a job, he was giving him the platform to change the entire culture of the airline. It wasn't just about the money, the investments, or the technologies that had saved countless lives. It was about people and how they were treated. It was about Marcus having the power to ensure that the company's success wasn't built on the backs of those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or undervalued. But the responsibility wasn't lost on Marcus. He understood that this wasn't going to be easy. Overhauling an entire corporate culture was no small feat, and there would undoubtedly be resistance from those who preferred the old ways, the entrenched attitudes that had allowed inequality to fester. He had been fighting this battle for years, but now, for the first time, he had the power to make real change, to create a system where every individual could thrive, regardless of their race, background, or any other factor. When Marcus accepted the offer, the CEO seemed almost relieved, as if this was the first step in turning the company's course around. They both knew that it would be a long road ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt hopeful not just for himself, but for the future of the airline and the people who work there. Marcus's first day back in the cockpit was surreal. He had spent so many years flying, commanding planes, and saving lives in the most dire of circumstances, but now, as he sat in the pilot's seat once again, it felt different. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It wasn't about simply flying a plane. It was about something greater, a chance to teach, to shape, and to lead. The training sessions he oversaw were unlike any he had been a part of before. Instead of focusing solely on the technical aspects of aviation, Marcus made sure to integrate the principles of diversity, inclusion, and fairness into every aspect of the training. Pilots, flight crews, and even ground staff were all given the tools they needed to recognize their biases, confront them, and build a more equitable workplace for everyone. He didn't just want to teach them how to fly. He wanted to teach them how to see people as people, not stereotypes. He wanted them to understand that everyone had something valuable to offer, regardless of their appearance or background. The program was met with mixed reactions at first. Some employees were resistant, unwilling to change their deeply held beliefs, or unwilling to acknowledge that the company's culture had been flawed for so long. But as Marcus continued to lead, something started to shift. The more people listened to his story, the more they understood the importance of the changes he was advocating for. Marcus's personal experiences, his achievements, and his ability to lead by example began to break down the walls of skepticism. Slowly but surely, people began to recognize that the changes were not just necessary, they were vital to the future of the company. And yet, even as the changes began to take root, Marcus knew that there was still much work to be done. This was just the beginning. The company was still in the process of healing, still learning how to fully embrace the principles of fairness and equality. Marcus had been given a chance to make a difference, but that difference would take time. It would take effort, collaboration, and most importantly, commitment from everyone in the company. He couldn't do it alone, and he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time, he had hope that real change was possible, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or marginalized in the workplace. The air was thick with tension as the airline's CEO watched the final preparations for the comprehensive diversity and inclusion training unfold. The company had made promises, and now it was time to deliver. The past few weeks had been filled with meetings, strategies, and an uncomfortable but necessary reckoning. After the truth about Marcus had come to light, and the role he played in both the company's success and in aviation safety, the changes had been rapid, and not everyone was pleased with the direction the airline was taking. The mandatory training sessions for all employees, from pilots to flight attendants to ground staff, were part of a larger plan to overhaul the company's culture. It was a painful process, but it was one the airline could not afford to skip. The CEO knew that true transformation couldn't happen without addressing the deep-rooted biases that had allowed the company to overlook talent based on race, gender, and background. Marcus's return had shaken things up more than anyone could have expected, but it had also brought clarity to the company's long-standing issues with inequality. "Today we start fixing what we've broken," the CEO said during a company-wide meeting, his voice heavy with a burden of responsibility. "We've let down our employees, we've let down our customers, and we've let down Marcus, but we will make it right." The CEO's words were firm, but there was no denying the challenges ahead. For years, the company had operated under a system that, intentionally or not, allowed discrimination to thrive. Managers and staff who had looked down on Marcus, questioning his right to be in first class, questioning his ability as a pilot, had been allowed to continue unchecked. But now, those who had been involved in the mistreatment of Marcus were facing the consequences. In the days that followed the announcement of the training program, the airline's HR department began taking swift action. Several supervisors, including those who had been complicit in Marcus's exclusion from the cockpit and mistreatment at the gate, were either fired or demoted. Those responsible for questioning Marcus's qualifications without cause, those who had made snide comments, and those who had actively participated in creating an environment that allowed discrimination to persist were held accountable. One of the more significant and public moves was the termination of the security personnel involved in singling Marcus out during the boarding process. The staff member who had rudely questioned Marcus's qualifications, asking him if he was sure he was capable of piloting a plane, was immediately dismissed. It was a move that shocked many within the company, but it was necessary. The airline could no longer tolerate an environment where bias could flourish unchecked, and those in positions of authority had to be held accountable for their actions. Alongside these firings, the airline also began paying out significant settlements to passengers who had been affected by the discriminatory treatment they had witnessed or experienced. Marcus's mistreatment had set in motion a wave of awareness. and it quickly became clear that the public would no longer tolerate such behavior from an institution that had once prided itself on being a leader in the industry. The company settled with several passengers who had either witnessed the discrimination firsthand or had been involved in the incidents surrounding Marcus's removal from the flight. The settlements, totaling millions of dollars, were an undeniable sign that the airline was taking the matter seriously. However, it was not just the passengers who needed to be compensated. The real cost would come from the lost trust and credibility that the airline had built over the years. Despite the public apologies and the compensation, the true reckoning was only beginning. A formal investigation into the airline's practices was launched. What had started as a personal matter, one that had affected Marcus, had quickly become a broader issue that reached into every corner of the company. The investigation was a public one, and as the details of Marcus's treatment came to light, it triggered a wave of legal actions against the airline. Several passengers who had been present during the incident filed lawsuits against the airline, alleging racial discrimination. The cases gained traction quickly, fueled by public outrage over how Marcus had been treated. The media, which had once been critical of the airline's safety record, now began to report on the systemic racism within the company. The legal battles were not only damaging to the airline's reputation, they were financially draining as well. The company faced a lawsuit that could cost them up to $50 million in damages, a sum that represented a significant portion of their profits. The lawsuit claimed that Marcus had been unjustly removed from the flight, that his qualifications had been questioned based solely on his race, and that the treatment he had received was part of a larger pattern of discriminatory behavior within the airline. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the CEO and other executives were forced to confront a brutal truth. The company's commitment to inclusivity had been nothing more than a facade. The corporate culture had been so deeply entrenched with biases that they had allowed these practices to go on for far too long. The investigation revealed that Marcus's experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger issue within the company. The sheer scale of the problem was shocking. The news of a lawsuit reverberated through the industry, and for a time, the airline was under siege. It wasn't just a matter of fixing the company's internal policies. It was about rebuilding trust with the public and their customers. The airline stock prices plummeted as investors reacted to the scandal, and the company faced growing calls for accountability. The CEO knew that the airline's very future was at stake. If the company didn't handle this situation with the utmost care, they risked losing everything. As the investigation continued, Marcus's role in the company's success came into sharper focus. He wasn't just a pilot, a victim of discrimination. He was a key figure in the airline's growth. The public now saw him as a hero, someone who had quietly shaped the safety technologies that kept passengers safe. However, that recognition came too late. By then, the damage to the airline's reputation had already been done. It would take years to recover, and even then, some things could never be fully repaired. Amidst the chaos, Marcus remained resolute. His focus had never been on revenge or public recognition. His goal had always been to ensure that the airline and the industry at large would learn from its mistakes. The legal battles, the media attention, and the corporate upheaval were all part of the price that needed to be paid for true change to take place. The company, under the leadership of the CEO, committed to a complete overhaul of its diversity and inclusion policies. It wasn't enough to simply pay out settlements or fire a few individuals. They needed to change the way the company operated at every level. The airline had to make sure that the lessons from this painful chapter were learned, and that no one else would have to go through what Marcus had. But as the company struggled to recover from the fallout, the CEO knew that the real work was just beginning. The road to redemption would not be easy, and Marcus's decision to return to the cockpit had already set the stage for the next phase of this journey. The company would need to prove, through actions and not just words, that they were committed to true change that would be sustainable, meaningful, and reflective of the values that Marcus had fought for. The aftermath of the lawsuit had been nothing short of catastrophic for the airline. As the dust began to settle and the final rulings were made, The company found itself grappling with not only the financial ramifications, but the reputational damage that would take years, if not decades, to undo. The legal system had delivered its verdict, but the consequences were far-reaching. The employees who had been directly involved in the discriminatory actions towards Marcus, from the gate agents to the higher-level executives who had turned a blind eye to the systemic biases in the company, were not just facing the consequences within the organization, they were facing public scrutiny and severe financial penalties. It was a sobering day when the CEO announced the firings and the financial penalties. The company's board of directors had decided that enough was enough. There would be no tolerance for those who had contributed to Marcus's mistreatment. Several senior executives, who had either been complicit in allowing a culture of discrimination to flourish or who had actively participated in undermining Marcus, were dismissed immediately. Their severance packages were rescinded, and, in a highly unprecedented move, the company imposed hefty financial penalties on them. Penalties that amounted to millions of dollars. These executives, who had once been the pillars of the company's success, now found themselves publicly humiliated and financially burdened by their actions. The CEO, in a pointed statement, made it clear that the company would not allow its leaders to act with impunity when they endangered the integrity of the entire organization. We cannot and will not tolerate a culture that allows the mistreatment of any employee, let alone someone who has given so much to the success of this company, he said. Those responsible for the discrimination will not only face the consequences of their actions, but they will also be held financially accountable for the damage they have caused. The decision to fine the executives was a bold one, designed to send a message both internally and externally. It was a symbolic act of taking ownership, acknowledging the deep flaws in the system, and attempting to restore the company's integrity. However, the changes didn't stop at the executives. The airline also moved swiftly to hold accountable the mid-level managers, flight attendants, and supervisors who had been directly involved in the discriminatory treatment of Marcus. These individuals faced a range of penalties, including suspension, demotion, and mandatory retraining on diversity and inclusion. Many of these employees had been with the company for years, and the shakeup within the workforce sent shockwaves throughout the organization. Some of these employees quietly resigned rather than face the public shame of their actions, while others were outright fired, depending on the severity of their involvement in the scandal. This swift and aggressive approach to accountability was not only a reflection of the company's commitment to change, but also a way to begin the long and difficult process of restoring public trust. The airline, once seen as an industry leader, was now under a microscope, with its every action scrutinized by the media, regulators, and most importantly, its passengers. The company's reputation had been shattered, and it would take far more than a few firings to restore it. But these firings, coupled with the significant financial penalties imposed on those responsible, sent a strong message to the rest of the industry. Discriminatory behavior would not be tolerated, no matter who you were. Despite the significant internal shakeup, the consequences of the scandal were not confined to the walls of the airline. The community, both the aviation industry and the general public, reacted strongly to the events that had unfolded. Passengers, especially those who had witnessed Marcus's mistreatment, began to speak out. Social media campaigns calling for justice were launched, and passengers who had experienced or witnessed the discrimination shared their stories in droves. Many of these passengers expressed their outrage not just at the airline's treatment of Marcus, but at the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked for so long. The voices of these passengers were powerful, and the airline was forced to respond. They could no longer ignore the calls for accountability. As the public outcry grew louder, the company began to feel the weight of the growing pressure. The CEO, in an attempt to address the mounting criticism, made a public statement acknowledging the pain and hurt caused by the airline's actions. "We failed our passengers, we failed our employees, and we failed Marcus. For that, we are deeply sorry," he said. "But we are committed to making it right, and we will stop at nothing to ensure that something like this never happens again." The backlash, however, was far from over. A new wave of lawsuits began to surface. passengers who had been impacted by the discriminatory treatment, some of whom had been on Marcus's flight or had witnessed the events firsthand, filed claims against the airline. These lawsuits, which were quickly gaining traction, cited racial discrimination, wrongful removal from flights, and emotional distress caused by the mistreatment. With each new filing, the airline found itself in a deeper legal quagmire, facing potential damages that could run into tens of millions of dollars. The company's lawyers worked around the clock to try to mitigate the financial damage, but the truth was clear. This scandal had cost them far more than money. They had lost the trust of their customers, their employees, and their stakeholders. The stock price continued to plummet as investors reacted to the ongoing lawsuits and the public relations nightmare that was unfolding in real time. As the lawsuits mounted, the company was forced to settle with several passengers for significant sums, further draining its financial resources. These settlements, though necessary to avoid protracted legal battles, were a clear acknowledgement of the company's wrongdoings. In total, the airline was looking at potential liabilities of up to $50 million in damages, a sum that threatened to undermine their ability to recover financially. But the real damage was to the company's culture. The legal and financial consequences were significant, but they were only part of the equation. The real challenge for the airline was to rebuild its internal environment, to restore the sense of unity and trust that had been destroyed by the actions of a few individuals. The public had already made its judgment, and now it was up to the company to prove that it could change. The CEO knew that rebuilding trust would require more than just firing the bad apples. The company needed to overhaul its entire approach to diversity and inclusion, creating a system where every employee felt valued, respected, and heard. They had already started implementing the new training programs, but this was just the beginning. The company had to prove, through action and not just words, that it was truly committed to creating a fair and equitable environment for everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background. And for Marcus, the changes were personal. While he had fought for this reform for years, seeing the airline finally take responsibility was a bittersweet victory. The damage had been done, and the scars would take time to heal. But he knew that this was the beginning of something bigger, something that could change the industry for good. In the weeks following the whirlwind of legal battles and corporate upheaval, the ripple effects of Marcus's treatment began to settle. The public outcry had forced the airline to make drastic changes, but more importantly, it had ignited a shift within the company itself. What had started as a crisis, an unforeseen scandal that threatened to undo everything the airline had worked for, was beginning to morph into something else. It was becoming a catalyst for long overdue change, a transformation that would take years to fully realize, but was already beginning to unfold before their eyes. For Marcus, this was the culmination of a journey he had never asked for, but was determined to see through to the end. While the financial penalties, the firings, and the settlements were significant, they were never his primary goal. His aim had always been for a fundamental shift in how people were treated, regardless of their skin color, their gender, or their background. The real work, he knew, was not just in the consequences, but in the way the airline could rebuild its culture from the ground up. The first signs of genuine change came from the most unlikely of sources. Several of the flight attendants, supervisors, and managers who had previously been involved in the discriminatory treatment of Marcus reached out to him privately. At first, the apologies were cautious, tentative attempts to repair bridges that had long been burned. But over time, those apologies grew more heartfelt, more genuine. One by one, they admitted their mistakes, acknowledging that their behavior had been wrong not only because it had hurt Marcus, but because it had undermined the integrity of the entire company. They began to understand that their actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader culture that had allowed racism to thrive unchecked. They understood that their failure to challenge the status quo had harmed the very organization they had worked for, and in the end, had hurt them too. Many of them had lost their positions, some facing financial penalties for their actions, and the realization dawned that discrimination, in any form, ultimately damaged everyone involved, not just the victims. The apologies were not just about words, they were about actions. In several instances, Marcus found that the people who had wronged him were now actively working to undo the harm they had caused. Flight attendants who had once avoided him or treated him with contempt now volunteered for the company's new diversity and inclusion programs, actively engaging in the process of learning and self-reflection. Supervisors who had once dismissed Marcus's qualifications now took part in company-wide training sessions, learning about unconscious bias, systemic racism, and how to create a more inclusive workplace. For the first time in Marcus's career, he felt that the people around him weren't just apologizing. They were taking responsibility for their actions, understanding the weight of their mistakes, and committing to change. For Marcus, this shift was both gratifying and bittersweet. He had fought for this kind of transformation for years, and while he could see that progress was being made, the scars of the past would never fully disappear. He had spent so much of his life proving himself, constantly striving to be seen for who he was, an accomplished pilot, a skilled leader, and a person worthy of respect. And yet, for so long, he had been overlooked, underestimated, and marginalized. The acknowledgement from his colleagues, while important, could not erase the years of bias and discrimination he had endured. But he understood that the work wasn't just about him. It was about creating a better environment for everyone who came after him, a place where people didn't have to fight for their worth simply because of the way they looked or the assumptions others made about them. As the months passed, the company began to implement deeper structural changes. The Diversity and Inclusion Training Program, which had been hastily introduced in response to the crisis, evolved into a comprehensive, company-wide initiative. The program wasn't just about diversity in the workforce. It was about creating a culture of respect where every employee, from the flight attendants to the executives, could understand their role in shaping a more inclusive environment. The company instituted a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination in any form, and that policy was backed up by a robust system of accountability. Employees knew that their actions had consequences, and that the company would stand by its commitment to treating every individual with dignity and respect. The airline also brought in outside experts, specialists in diversity, equity, and inclusion, to assist in the overhaul. These experts worked closely with Marcus, who had now become a central figure in the company's transformation. While Marcus's primary role was still that of a pilot, his responsibilities had expanded. He was no longer just a symbol of the company's failure. He was a leader in its rebirth. His experiences, his insight into the aviation industry, and his deep commitment to fairness made him the perfect person to guide the company through its cultural evolution. Marcus's role was no longer just about flying planes. He was now tasked with overseeing the training and development of every employee, ensuring that the lessons learned from his experiences were embedded into the very fabric of the company. As the company's transformation began to take hold, it started to see tangible results. Internal surveys showed a marked improvement in employee satisfaction, with many workers reporting that they felt more valued and respected than ever before. Diversity within leadership roles increased, and there was a noticeable shift in how the company's employees interacted with one another. The changes didn't just affect the people Marcus had worked with directly. They rippled throughout the entire company, from the ground crew to the senior executives. And as the airline began to rebuild its reputation in the eyes of the public, it was evident that the company's newfound commitment to fairness and inclusivity was something that would set it apart from its competitors in the industry. But the true test of the company's progress came when the CEO, along with other top executives, made a public statement acknowledging their mistakes and outlining the steps the company had taken to rectify them. The apology was not just about words. It was backed up by the real, concrete changes that had been made in the organization. The CEO spoke candidly about the failures of the past, the systemic issues that had allowed discrimination to persist, and the company's commitment to ensuring that those mistakes would never be repeated. It was an apology, but it was also a declaration of the airline's new mission, one that was rooted in equity, respect, and fairness. For Marcus, the public apology was the final piece of the puzzle. The company had finally recognized the depth of the harm it had caused, not just to him, but to the many employees and passengers who had been affected by its culture of discrimination. The apology wasn't perfect, and the road to full recovery would be long. But it was a start, a real, tangible acknowledgement of the pain caused, and a commitment to doing better. For the first time in his career, Marcus felt seen. He had fought not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had ever been treated as less than. And as he stood at the helm of the company's transformation, Marcus realized that the work wasn't over. Change was a continuous process, one that required vigilance, commitment, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. The company had taken the first steps toward healing, but there was always more to be done. And Marcus, now not only a pilot, but a leader in the company's cultural overhaul, was ready for the journey ahead. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting updates. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the twists and turns in the story. What do you think about the changes Marcus experienced? And the company's transformation? Where are you watching from? And what are your thoughts on how this situation unfolded? Share your comments below.